think I'll just start then. I mean, the principal concern that I will bring to this book when I start writing it is the way that debt shapes what we think, what we believe about ourselves, how we relate to other people, how we understand our place in the world. So that's the direction it's going in, and the sheer power of economic ideology. And this is not something that was invented with the contemporary sort of neoliberal era. This is long since been the case. And so today I'm just going to go back through some of the history of Scripture and some of the pre-biblical history associated with debt and forgiveness of debt. In particular, I want to talk about debt amnesties in the ancient Near East, and then how that impacts on Jubilee, Sabbath, and ultimately forgiveness. And forgiveness of sins being the sharp end of an entire tradition. It was a few years since I read the late David Graeber's book on debt, which I'll talk more about later on. But at the beginning of that book, he simply asks, why should we repay debt? Why is it necessary to repay debt? Why has debt been sanctified in our culture? Paying your debt sounds bizarrely uncontentious, a basic moral assumption that any good person is supposed to do. But should people pay their debts? If we live in a culture that's unwittingly sanctified debt, a culture that's saturated with an ideology of debt, so much so that it's come to define who we are. What if debt has been normalized to the point where we can no longer assess whether or not it is moral? Now, so that you don't have to keep looking at my face all evening, I've just got a few pictures that I will speak to. So I'm going to have a crack at sharing what's on my screen. No, I'm not leaving the meeting. Hopefully, you'll see a picture I took 2 years ago in France. That is not quite the Statue of Liberty. It's the one that predates it, that was produced by the same chap that made it. But it is, the Statue of Liberty is one of the most iconic images of liberation from our entire debt-shaped culture. Statue of Liberty, and at the foot of it is a poem that you may be familiar with. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. And the poem by Emma Lazarus is actually borrowed from Bronze Age pledges of debt amnesty. And the word used for freedom is derived from the Mesopotamian word for debt forgiveness. The kind of liberty that's celebrated by the Statue of Liberty is debt cancellation. You may recognize that picture. It's even more explicit. The Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, said to have rung out to proclaim independence across the land when the US made its declaration of independence. And it's citing a Leviticus text. Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. And the word for liberty, again, is rooted in that ancient Mesopotamian word for debt cancellation. And there are some Americans today who say that because it's one of the most indebted nations, its inhabitants, its citizens are so thoroughly debt-ridden that the Liberty Bell itself has cracked. I suspect that probably has more to do with its age, but who knows. The Jewish practices of Sabbath and Jubilee and forgiveness all reflect different strands of a single tradition inherited from Bronze Age civilizations in Sumer and Babylon. And it's these ancient kingdoms that, in order to try and maintain stable economies, recognize the crucial importance of issuing debt amnesties. And these amnesties included the cancellation of personal debt, not business debt, personal debt the release of debt slaves and the return of arable land to an agricultural population. And although biblical scholars have often assumed that debt cancellations were impracticable and therefore Jubilee commandments could never have been applied, economic historians in recent decades have highlighted how debt cancellation is not only desirable but absolutely necessary. Most notably, there's a historian called Michael Hudson. He's a godson of Leon Trotsky, actually, and he also is one of the few people that accurately predicted the debt crisis of 2008. And he did it using Babylonian models, which he says are far more sophisticated than models used in universities in the contemporary era. But Michael Hudson has orchestrated a series of colloquia out of Harvard University. And they've been studies of nationwide debt amnesties running from the 3rd millennium before Christ through Israel, Greece, Rome, and so on. And Hudson's history really locates Israel as a nation and Jesus in particular within the mainstream of this tradition in such a way as to reveal hugely unexplored ethical dimensions of the gospel narrative. This is Michael Hudson's book. I think it only came out about 2 years ago. It's not very easy to get hold of. It took a long time to come to me, but it's one of the most groundbreaking books I've ever read. His work begins with a question of interest raised on debts that are owed, and interest allowing debts to grow at a faster rate than the ability to repay them had the effect of destabilizing the economy, because creditors could collect debts from those who were unable to pay by seizing their land, their family, and seizing the debtors themselves as some form of recompense. Sometimes, though, the debt couldn't be helped. People would fall into debt because of crop failures, because of personal tragedy, because of war and famine and so on. It often meant that through no fault of your own, you could find yourself in serious debt arrears. And the major task of Babylonian and other Mesopotamian rulers on taking the throne was to restore the economic balance by cancelling agrarian personal debts, liberating debt slaves, and reversing land forfeitures for citizens who are holding self-supporting land. And these debt cancellations, these edicts, were decreed not because these kings were lovely people and we don't have nice kings anymore. It's not because they were kind and nice and they wanted to help the impoverished masses out of the goodness of their hearts. Without a population that is free to live and work the land, rulers would be unable to call on them for three things. They would be unable to call on them for ongoing tax payments, because debts that can't be paid won't be paid. They were unable to call on them for corvée labour, that's unpaid work for several days a year that you give to your rulers in return for land tenure. And the third area was military service. You need people naturally motivated to defend their own land. And because kings wanted to maintain these three things, and they needed these three things, they often would cancel debts. And it was a fairly straightforward matter. Cancelling the nation's debts was straightforward because they were ultimately cancelling debts to themselves, cancelling debts to the ruling classes. And it enabled them to maintain the status quo from which they benefited. So it made sense. The danger of allowing debts to grow unregulated is simply that creditors would grow power, they would gain wealth, and they would establish themselves with sufficient resources to become a class, an oligarchic class with the potential to challenge the authority of the king himself. And since common folk fleeing debt slavery would abandon their land to avoid being enslaved, the kings would lose the taxes that had been farmed from that land. They'd lose the citizens that made up their armies. They'd lose the manpower required for public works, and their authority over their nation would thus be weakened. On the other hand, creditors would be able to amass debt slaves of their own. They'd be capable then of acquiring lands that were formerly under royal control, and they'd be capable of raising mercenary armies financed by their accumulated wealth. So, all that to say that for these ancient Mesopotamian kings, occasional debt cancellations made perfect economic and political sense. I'm just going to ask you a question now without being able to hear anyone answer. Does anyone recognize what this picture is? At least one of you. I think it's in the British Museum. Thank you, Ian. This is the Rosetta Stone. If you've heard of the Rosetta Stone, you maybe know why it's historically important. If you look closely on the picture, you can see there are 3 separate languages there, and it's been key to unpacking some of the translations from languages we didn't understand. And so it's an absolutely crucial text for people working in interpretation of these ancient Near Eastern languages. But what nobody seems to know is what that stone says, which is quite shocking. It's world famous. Nobody knows what it says. That message on that stone is a declaration of debt amnesty. It is a debt cancellation document, hyper important, but for some reason we rarely hear about that side of it. The practice of debt cancellation then, it was sensible, it was widespread, but this was not going to last forever. With the passage of time, business merchants and those who were able to farm taxes managed to find clever ways around the royal decrees of debt amnesty, and it allowed them to accumulate growing resources. And this, in turn, eventually led to the establishment of the oligarchic classes that were feared by rulers and subjects alike. And these new oligarchies gained sufficient power to exert massive influence over the monarchies, and it changed the economic dynamics to favor their own wealth accumulation. And this meant that they refused to allow these occasional declarations of a clean slate for everyone. Wealthy aristocratic families gained permanent control over the land, and they ensured that the populace were reduced to a state of permanent, inescapable debt peonage. The trouble is that this is an economic norm that is destined in the long term to precipitate complete societal collapse from within. And this has happened again and again, and it's recorded in most detail by these splendid fellows. That's Diodorus of Sicily, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, and then that's Livy and Plutarch. Widening the gap between the wealthiest elites and the people of the land had created widespread debt slavery. It had depleted the population. It had concentrated money into the hands of a tiny minority with the privilege, as a tiny minority always have enjoyed, to employ tax avoidance strategies. And this in turn results in the breakdown of the money economy. And the clearest account of these collapses are offered by these Roman historians, and it's almost with one voice. They lament how Rome's oligarchic creditor elites had impoverished and disenfranchised their populations to the point where they eventually crumbled under the weight of their own avarice. This is not only a phenomenon in Rome. The Jewish tradition of Jubilee is rooted in the ancient Near Eastern practice of debt amnesty. And a key theme running through Hebrew scripture was the nation's widespread failure to honour that tradition. You see it in Mosaic laws, which legislate debt amnesties, and they warn of the consequences of failing to issue them. The main texts are Exodus 21 to 23, Leviticus 25 is the big one, Deuteronomy 15 and 24. So it's there in the Mosaic laws. The prophets demand that rulers honour debt amnesties, in particular Isaiah and Jeremiah. And the history books show that the massive calamities that were to befall the nation of Israel were ultimately a result of Israel's failure to practice debt amnesty. It's even there in the post-exilic texts where debt amnesties are furnished with cosmic significance. When it comes to Jubilee, Jubilee is widely understood as the means of announcing the good news of the debt amnesties detailed in Leviticus 25. And the Hebrew Yobel is generally deemed to be the shout or the trumpet blast. And it was this blast that initiated a holy event. And it's most likely that the word Jubilee refers to the instrument, the horn, that heralds this year of jubilation. And it's difficult to imagine, I think, the joy that might be experienced if your life is about to be transformed by the blast that echoes around the land, this long-awaited national proclamation of debt amnesty. The legislation declares that every 49 years, that's 7 weeks of years, those who have become debt slaves are to be freed because all debts have been cancelled, and those separated from their ancestral properties, which could be due either to debt slavery or to land being forfeit, those people separated from their ancestral properties are free to return. The property is restored to the family. And then you have to imagine these massive, wide-scale family reunions. The land itself is also, in a sense, to be freed because the land remains fallow in that year. And that's not just a practical ecological measure, but it's a symbolic reminder that Israel does not own the land. Israel are merely tenants of their divine landlord. The entire nation then is given a clean slate, and underlying it all is this pre-Judaic Akkadian concept of anduraram, debt amnesty. And it's the concept that found its way into Hebrew in the cognate word deror. And this word for debt cancellation is employed not only in the legal text, but in the prophetic tradition, in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. The prophets who were painfully aware that Israel's leaders, having succumbed to influence by these powerful creditor elites, were failing to proclaim debt amnesties. It's something the prophets are repeatedly addressing. And it doesn't mean only that justice is therefore denied to the poorest members of Israelite society, but in turn, that society itself is morally, communally, and economically eviscerated. And this is what we see happening. When you're economically depleted to this extent, then you're unable to withstand external pressure. And so when external pressure came, Israel fell. This is borne out by Jeremiah's parting shot, his parting rhetorical shot before the nation was finally dragged into exile. It was to attribute the disaster of Israel's refusal to honor its commitment to Jubilee. I think I will read this out. You're not supposed to do this on PowerPoint, but therefore, thus saith the Lord, you have not obeyed me by granting a release. It's that word, the debt amnesty, to your neighbors and friends. I am going to grant you a release, says the Lord, a release to the sword, to pestilence, and to famine. I'll make you a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Historians, I think, are still divided over whether when these Jubilee texts were written, whether they're original to these Mosaic laws that predate the monarchy, or whether they're later additions from some time after the exile, when the exiles had learned debt amnesty from the Babylonians and then projected them back into those ancient texts. But in any case, the text in its present form presents a narrative in which debt amnesties are carved into Israel's legal foundations. And even though they're scribed into Israel's fundamental laws, they're still largely ignored by Israel's leaders. And it's that lapse which precipitates Israel's downfall. There's nevertheless significant consensus among historians about how the Judaic textual tradition transformed the practice of Mesopotamian debt amnesty. And they did this rather than leaving decisions over debt amnesty to the caprice or the whim of monarchs and kings. The Jewish legislators inscribed them through the core of Israel's identity. The Mesopotamian kings had issued these amnesties sporadically, when they access the throne, if there's a time of famine, if there's a war or something. But in Judaism, they become a regular necessity. And by making debt cancellation routine rather than occasional, Israel have conceived a society that is characterized by mutual forgiveness. Israel, after all, was the nation that was born out of a divine act of liberation from slavery. The principal refrain echoing throughout the biblical literature is a reminder that God himself is in the business of liberation. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And its faithful Israel worshipped a God whose nature was to bring about amnesty, forgiveness, liberation. They're all the same word that we translate as forgiveness in the New Testament. Sabbath is the regular micro Jubilee celebration in which worshippers sought to ground their society and their identity in relationship with this liberating God. A constant reminder to everyone that the current state of affairs would not last forever. So if you're a super privileged Israelite, you could not remain forever secure in your privilege because debt cancellation was coming and you knew it. Equally, if you were oppressed, if you'd fallen on hard times, you could not forever be robbed of hope because you know that debt amnesty is coming. For those in power with debt slaves at their disposal, it's a reminder that slaves are destined to be free every 7 years, meaning that they are not the property of a slave owner, but they are children of Abraham. And it's a reminder that debts are to be cancelled, the land returned. And for those subjected to debt slavery and poverty and homelessness, within the economy of Israel that's founded as a nation of freed slaves, imbalances are addressed at a regular day of reckoning. And notice the economic nature of that word that we use as a day of judgment, day of reckoning. On the Sabbath, in front of God, everyone is of equal status. The intended ideological effect of Sabbath is difficult to overstate. If the weekly Sabbath entails worship of a God whose nature is to effect liberation, it would prove extremely difficult for an ideology promoting the sanctity of debt to take root. The ideology of debt as it's taken root in our contemporary society has been borne out by David Graeber, who sadly died just last month. But this guy was, he wrote Debt the First 5,000 Years, and that's another one of those ground-shaking books. It's a very lengthy book, but if you've got time to read 500 pages, it's well worth it. And in this book, Graeber powerfully questioned the religious power of debt in our age. The sanctity of debt, after all, is a belief system, a form of worship that imperceptibly establishes itself as normal, natural, unquestionable. The conviction that debts, regardless of how they came about, absolutely have to be honoured. And some people today are born into debt and can never escape it. It's fine to boast about always paying your debts if you're wealthy and privileged. But if you're born in debt, if you're not born into unwitting privilege, you have a different view of what debt is. I think for modern interpreters, as heirs to a tradition in which the sanctity of debt has gone largely unquestioned, the whole aspect of debt cancellation has been a neglected element of Sabbath. Debt forgiveness has been spiritualized away from political life. It's been historicized, pushed into the practices of a pre-civilized economy. And it's been eschatologized. It's been postponed to some kind of a post-mortem future, leaving present injustice unimpeded. But Sabbath, according to Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, as some of you will know, Sabbath is a palace in time, a place in which the God of creation and salvation and future confronts worshippers with his own living presence here and now. And if this God who we encounter on Sabbath is a loving, holy, debt-forgiving, slave-freeing God, these dimensions of his divinity cannot, with any legitimacy, be bracketed out of our Sabbath celebration. So for worshipping communities, to celebrate Sabbath is to expose our personal, spiritual, political, economic, relational, social dimensions of our humanity to God who invites us into his presence. In Hebrew, as you may know, to Sabbath is literally to stop, shavat, to undergo profound ideological reorientation as we regularly relearn our true place in the created order, our true status in front of Israel's God. And the amnesty, forgiveness, liberation into which Sabbath draws the worshipping community is not just a periodic remedy for a broken, sinful, debt-ridden world, so much as it's the fulfillment of creation itself. Sabbath draws together the creation and the creation of the people out of slavery in gratitude for the mighty actions of God. It looks forward to deliverance from injustice and unrighteousness and sin. It anticipates the new age in which liberation in all its fullness is finally established. So when you celebrate Sabbath, it should be an ideological earthquake in the present that shakes the foundation of all legitimate and illegitimate human achievement and failure. It shakes the foundation of all credit and debt. It shakes the foundations of our deluded and our legitimate self-perceptions. Sabbath is a jubilaic celebration, finally immersed in the depths of God's radical, multidimensional allegiance to humanity. In the first century, it's a key identity marker of the people of Israel. And Jesus encounters its observance in the Gospels as bogged down in peripheral regulations that detracted from its liberational origins and purpose. And that's reflected in some of the conflicts that we see Jesus engaged in. In particular, conflicts surrounding forgiveness. Forgiveness of sins and forgiveness of debts are practices that are inextricably interwoven in Hebrew scripture and in the gospel narrative. One of the things that Michael Hudson draws out very well, I think, is how these traditions of forgiveness of sin and forgiveness of debt have evolved in tandem. And he uses the illustration of the Wehrgild, which I learned when I was studying Anglo-Saxon. If one person has offended another person or committed a crime against another person, you don't want the other person to retaliate. You don't want some kind of a horrible feud to emerge. And so you would set a financial price on the debts you committed to somebody. So if I accidentally chop off somebody's hand, that's going to cost me some money that I'll have to pay to them. Now, if they're just a slave, I won't have to pay very much. If they're a king, that's going to cost me a fortune. But the Wehrgild is the money that I have to hand over. And that way, it's the day of reckoning. Our accounts are settled. we're clear with one another, no feuds are going to develop. That's the Wehrgild. And until I've paid that debt, once the sentence has been passed, until I've paid that debt, I am in a state of sin, of Schuld in German. I'm in that state of owing the other person. The sin that an Anglo-Saxon had committed left them in a state of indebtedness, which could not be removed until the price was paid. So to be forgiven of the sin was thus to remove the debt. And to be forgiven from the debt was to absolve the sin. So you can see how the two are interrelated. Of course, this illustration doesn't address the fact that debt forgiveness issued by a nation's leader does remain disconnected from personal culpability for sin committed by an individual in front of God. And as Hudson showed, falling into debt usually had nothing to do with individual culpability, but with the culpability of creditors who'd forced vulnerable individuals into debt. And this way of looking at debt and forgiveness can make it sound like Jesus is only speaking about debt forgiveness. And some readings from this perspective still fail to take into account other aspects of liberation. But you can trace those other aspects of liberation from the account I've outlined here. Israel worshipped this God of gratuitous, pan-dimensional forgiveness. And debt amnesty is a fundamental and indispensable dimension of that forgiveness. So if God himself has forgiven the sin and the debt of an individual, how can that individual remain in financial debt to a wealthy Israelite? If a Palestinian peasant is granted a clean slate by Yahweh, how can any Israelite creditor fail to do the same? At the very least, on those jubilaic occasions required by Torah. And it may well be for this reason that in the Lord's Prayer, for instance, in Luke, forgiving sins requires in advance having forgiven other people's debts. They're different words in Luke 11. And it's also the logic of Matthew's parable of the unmerciful servant, which you'll know, Matthew 18, 21 and following. Forgiveness of sin, when it's granted by this God, delegitimizes any economic credit we might enjoy, and it delegitimizes any economic debt that we might have to a fellow Israelite. And if this is the case, then the wealthy creditors of Israel are likely to oppose not only Jesus' explicit teaching about wealth, but his seemingly innocuous teaching about forgiveness. And if you oppose Jesus' teaching on forgiveness, you're highly likely to have financial motives for doing that. Here, you may think of the of Hillel's prosbul clause. I don't know if you've heard of this. It's a legal loophole by Rabbi Hillel the Elder. I'm not quite sure about how old he lived, but he proposed a legal loophole to circumvent the legal effects of sabbatical and jubilaic debt cancellations by forcing powerless debtors to waive their rights in order to borrow money. Pious Jewish leaders with a concern to appear faithful to Torah could then, with the prosbul clause, ignore economic demands on the grounds that Hillel's authoritative religious tradition allowed their reputations to remain untarnished. People defend this clause by saying, well, if you know there's going to be a regular debt cancellation, why would you lend money to somebody? I mean, it sounds like a good question, but this all presupposes that the majority of debt is money that one person has borrowed from another in order to go and buy something they don't need, maybe. The reality is that I think it was over 70% of the actual cases of debt that Michael Hudson looked at were from tax arrears. Jesus initiates and implements an entire era of debt forgiveness. This is born out, the Nazareth Manifesto in Luke chapter 4 makes repeated appeal to this notion of forgiveness. It's the name of the era that Jesus is inviting his followers into. And by doing this, he not only undermines the religious and the legal status quo, but he threatens the economic and the political norms that were widely and deeply treasured. Good news to the poor is not going to be good news to everyone. And the ferocity of opposition that he faced is then hardly surprising. And it may be true, after all, to say that from a political perspective, Jesus was killed because of his economic policy. The forgiveness that he advocated was a dangerously aggressive practice, because liberation, whatever form it takes, requires that formidable forces, whether they're formidable forces in the political world or in the human psyche or in the spiritual world, relinquish highly treasured assets. And those highly treasured assets may be the human spirit, they may be economic resources, they may be dependency relationships. So all that to say, that is the biblical foundation of the book, which will go on to explore how the post-Christendom era coincides with the neoliberal era, which sanctifies debt beyond all imagination, an economic age that makes the sanctity of debt a religion, and that decrees to nations and to individuals that debts must be honoured. And that's not compatible with a Jesus who is in the business of forgiving rather than honouring debt. Thank you.